This is Surfing Through Cinema. I'm your host, Hawaii Harry. Today I will be discussing the next film for Classic Hollywood Week. This is a film about a serial killer, yet we never actually see any of his murders. And this is a classic film within the German Expressionist and film noir genre, and it stars the very talented Peter Lorre, who's famous for Casablanca and many other films made during the 1940s. This episode, of course, is all about Fritz Lang's classic, M. Okay, so some technical details about the film M. This is the first sound film that the director Fritz Lang made. He's known for making Metropolis, which we discussed in a past episode, and many other expressionist type films made in Germany. And this is one of his last ones he made in Germany before the Nazis came to power and he had to flee to America, where he would eventually make more film noir and more thriller-based movies. And this is kind of the start of that genre that he is pretty well known for as well. And another technical detail, this is one of the first movies to use what's called a leitmotif, associating a character with a musical tune. And this is a common practice within operas, but since sound movies were pretty new, there was nothing like that yet. And Peter Lorre's character, he whistles the tune in the Hall of the Mountain King, which you probably don't know the title to, but I'm sure you've heard a million times. It's such a popular song. Basically every trailer, like movie trailer ever has it. It's a really, really popular tune, and some consider this film of bringing it into the popular culture. Beforehand, it was kind of known from the opera and musical groups, but now it was brought forth in the movie culture. And so, as a result of this movie, all this happens all the time now. There are certain whistles, certain songs that you associate with a character. And with this one in particular, when the audience would hear it, you would know that the murderer was nearby and that he was about to commit a murder. So it's a really helpful and really cool technique you could use to have the audience think more versus actually seeing. So another technical detail, nowadays we have voice dubbing, so we just have voice actors who dub over English-speaking actors or vice versa. But back then that wasn't achievable, so what they would have to do is they'd have to painstakingly refilm entire scenarios and entire sequences with totally different actors, but they had to make it match up with the original language. So in this case, for the US version, all the actors had to be replaced with English-speaking ones, with the exception of Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre also spoke English, so he was able to do both the English and the German versions of this movie. Okay, so let's get into the plot of M. So a series of child murders are occurring throughout Berlin. And this is during the time in Berlin where there were a lot of serial killers that were all around Berlin. So this was definitely released due to the events going on around Germany. And then the police, to kind of prevent more child murders from happening, they take extreme measures in locking down the people, and they instate curfews, so anyone found outside at a certain time would be arrested. So they were taking drastic measures, but the point of it was they couldn't find the murderer. He'd always find a way to slip away and disappear before they could ever find him. And this has been going on for months and months and months. So they're just scrambling and struggling to find anything. The police are to their very, very rim. Some of them stay up for days on end. They're getting nowhere, and it's really sad. This is much to the dismay of the criminals that have organized a crime syndicate in that area, and they can't get any of their activities done without getting arrested. So they decide to take in their own hands to find the murderer so they can resume their day-to-day lives. After a couple weeks, they had a few spotters along the streets. They're able to locate the murderer, and they chase him into a building where he kind of locks himself into it. And they do find him in there, and they bring him before a kangaroo court, which is a very disheveled, very disorganized type of court, where the point of it is to completely convict the defendant rather than him having a rightful jury who would decide if his actions were justifiable or not. And the court was comprised of both criminals, victims from parents of the victims he had. So it seemed pretty reasonable that he heavily affected these people's lives. So it kind of makes sense that they would be harsh judges against him. However, he's given an attorney who's fighting in his behalf, who's saying, like, we need to bring him before a just system to determine if he's insane or not. And the people are going crazy. They can't believe that this would be the case. They believe he deserves to die. And as they're about to kill the murderer, the police break in and they capture him and take him before a real trial with real judges and a real jury, to bring order to the situation. And so the camera cuts to 3 of the mothers of the victims who are attending the trial, who are crying, and one of them says to the audience, one has to keep close watch over the children, and then she kind of eerily ends with, as it's fading out, all of you. So kind of a message directed towards all parents, not just the characters in the movie, but in real life, we need to keep watch of our children. And that's where it ends. It kind of ends on an ambiguous note. We don't know what actually happens to the murderer. If he gets tried or if he's executed, we don't know. But that's the plot. It's kind of a very interesting plot. We never actually see the murders that take place. We just see, for example, there's a little girl who has a ball that she bounces around. When the murder actually takes place, we just see her ball rolling down the street and the balloon she was carrying flying up into an electrical outlet, or not electrical outlet, into power lines. So without us actually seeing it, we can actually visualize in our minds what is going on, and which is very powerful use of imagery. But yeah, that's the plot for M. I'm going to go on a break real quick, but first, here's a message from our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Here's how. It's totally free. There are tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your computer and even your cell phone. But that's not all. Anchor distributes your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. You could even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Anchor is everything you need to make a complete podcast all in one small place. So go on and download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Okay, so we're back from our break. Now I'm going to get into some critical views and my personal views on the film M. Okay, so Variety magazine, back when M was released, said it has a few repetitious and a few slow scenes that could have been cut because it was kind of short, because it was kind of long and kind of repetitious. But recently, it's had more of a revamp and a relook at it to see if it actually is a good film or not. And now it has a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's one of the few movies that has such a high rating. And many lists, including Empire magazine and a couple others, have considered it one of the greatest films of all time. So this just shows that it sometimes takes time for movies to be appreciated, which sadly translates to cult classic. They're really popular amongst people, but weren't popular with the critics, so therefore it doesn't make a lot of money. And sadly, a lot of Fritz Lang's films during this era were not money makers. They were not financially successful as he would have liked. But despite that, nowadays people appraise and love this movie. I IMDb has this as number 93 on their top 250 movies. So a lot of critics and a lot of users everywhere give this film high regards and really like it. Which kind of leads to my personal views. So this is the first time I'd ever seen it. I had a basic idea what the movie was like, but I went in kind of blindly. Like, I didn't know really what to expect with it. Which I highly recommend for any type of movie watching. You know, try your best to not get spoiled, but it's kind of hard to now, especially with movies like Star Wars and all that. But do the best you can to watch the movie without any initial prejudice or any initial judgment to it. That way you can have a fully unbiased opinion, and then you can solidify it by looking at other people's views of it. So, the things I really liked in it, the subtle uses of symbolism and cinematography are amazing. They're some of the greatest. And considering this film was made in 1931, it's really impressive to see the type of work that went into the symbolism. In particular, the first death in the movie that occurs, and the only death we really see, but the only child death that occurs in the movie, there's a cuckoo clock that goes off right around the time of the murder, and then close to the end of the movie, there's another bell toll, and that's right before Peter Lorre's character gets arrested. So it's kind of his end time for his murders. Whether he actually ends up getting killed or not, we'll probably never know. But it is interesting to see the parallels between those two things. And just like how subtle the murders are, the cuckoo clock is pretty subtle as well. Whereas the clock at the end is very, very loud, and, you know, for the whole town to hear. Same goes for his trial. You know, the kangaroo court one with all the people. It's super loud, super disorganized, and very chaotic. Another point I really liked how we actually never see any of the murders. You know, it's really fascinating. Like in movies like Jaws, for example, we actually never really see the shark, not until the very, very end. So in the same instance with this, we never actually see any of the murders. We just see, for example, the little girl I mentioned earlier who had the bouncy ball. We just see that rolling away, and her balloons flying into the power lines. So, which I like a lot. I think it's better to imply something than it is to actually show it. Because a lot of things can be ruined in movies if we just see everything, or if everything is told to us rather than us trying to decide it for ourselves. And so Fritz Lang, he really did a great job of having the audience decide, you know, how the murders took place, how all of this occurred. Because sometimes the human imagination is sometimes more terrifying than what we actually see. Some critical points I have. The ending was pretty abrupt. I kind of wish we did see the resolution of it. But it makes sense why they didn't show it to us. We didn't want... I think they just wanted us to have a more... a personable approach to it. Kind of same idea as with the murders. We decide for ourselves how it actually ends. And I guess that kind of helps lead the audience to a more interpretive version of it. Which this is definitely not what was common for Hollywood. Now this was a German film, but nevertheless, in every Hollywood movie in this era, you would see a resolution. You would have a satisfying conclusion. But this was very, very rare to see something like this during this era. I kind of agree with variety. There were a few scenes that could have been trimmed down or cut out altogether, especially in the instance with the comparisons between the police and the criminals, you know, going back and forth to see what they're going to do. I think some of that could have been trimmed out. It wasn't entirely necessary to the plot. But other than that, I think it was a phenomenal film. I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. It's definitely not a happy movie. Afterward I kind of had to watch a few comedy TV episodes before I went to bed, but this is definitely one of those movies where it's fascinating to watch and look at. It kind of reminds me of just like crime dramas in general or criminal TV shows where even though none of us really would ever want to experience any of those horrors, it's still fascinating to look into. Alright, but those are my thoughts and feelings about the film M. Next time, I'll be discussing the next film for Star Wars Week. This is a film that fits perfectly for the holiday season, with tauntauns and wampas galore. I'm of course talking about The Empire Strikes Back, which is considered one of the greatest Star Wars movies of all time, and one of the greatest sequels of all time. Alright, well until next time, this has been Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry. Take care. Thank you for listening to Surfing Through Cinema. Make sure to check us out on Facebook at Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry and on Instagram with Surfing Through Cinema. We also have a website, www.anchor.fm/Surfing Through Cinema, where you can learn more details on upcoming episodes and on past episodes.